All right. Well, I've got a cup of coffee here on a cold, wet Wednesday morning, and we're going to talk a little bit about Canadian internment. So, obviously, Japanese internment starts, whether you're talking about Canada or the United States, with December 7th, 1941. President Roosevelt declares it the Day of Infamy, and there you go. Just a picture of Pearl Harbor. A couple more. We haven't talked a lot about Pearl Harbor, but the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor caught the island completely unaware. And this leaves us talking about one of the kind of darker times in both Canadian and U.S. history. So the war is on. Japan's Navy planes attack Hawaii, Singapore, Davao Wake, Guam, Isles. This is Tokyo. This Japanese Times and Advertiser. It was a Japanese-American newspaper, or Japanese-Canadian newspaper. Canadian sentiment. At the outbreak of the World War II in 1939, the population of British Columbia included around 21,000 Canadians of Japanese origin, 75% whom had residence rights, meaning that they had the rights of citizens. Now, residence versus somebody who's born there and a complete citizen is a little bit different, but they are, they should have quite a few rights. So, common belief held was that the Japanese are unable to assimilate into Canadian society as easily as those of European heritage. We're reading right now, and you will read some of the feelings towards the Japanese. A lot of it is motivated by racism, and then racism is often, and the discrimination that follows, is often along with either economic competition or a fear of others, fear of what others can be. The Japanese were often accused of not assimilating because they stayed within their own culture. They still spoke their own language. But a lot of cultures, not just the Japanese, were accused of not assimilating. And it seems to be more racially motivated than just the fact that they're not assimilating. Prime Minister Mackenzie King expressed a belief in the extreme difficulty of assimilating Japanese persons to Canada. And you can see that there's even some issues with the leader and his beliefs. So the Battle of Hong Kong, just something to talk about. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day 1941. Of the 1,975 Canadians, 290 were killed, 493 wounded. A further 260 died in awful conditions of prison camps in Hong Kong and Japan. Garrison of 6,000 troops, including many Canadian, capitulates to the Japanese. Enemy destroyed water supply. Governor and military commander to discuss terms of surrender. And we all know how surrender went with the Japanese. It didn't go well. Japanese submarines are known to have been operating off the coast of British Columbia. Although the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Canadian military evaluations suggested no imminent threat by Japanese Canadians, this assessment is not universally accepted, as there exists no guarantee of loyalty or passivity of the Japanese Canadians. Basically saying that although the military comes forward and says there's no threat, basically the National Police Force, who is tasked with protecting the homeland, says there is no threat, and yet a lot of people don't believe them. So what should be done? Resentment against the Japanese Canadians exploded into panic and anger in the British Columbia. 1,200 fishing boats were seized by the Canadian Navy in fear of spying. And this can be somewhat understandable. That, yeah, you don't want fishing boats because they could be communicating out there with submarines or something like that, although there was no proof of any of that happening. And you wouldn't necessarily take this as something else, except for the fact that we already know that the fishing licenses and the way that the fishing, the issues with the competition of Japanese fishermen versus white fishermen, we know that this was an issue going into the war. And so the question is, did that motivate the taking of all these fishing boats, or is this just one of those where somebody could be spying, so we're going to take everybody's boats away, and then that will make sure that they can't continue? The war offered a convenient excuse for the Canadians to address the Japanese-Canadian question, and that becomes kind of what we need to talk about. Obviously, the Japanese were discriminated against and not wanted in British Columbia. British Columbia has made their kind of feelings very clear on what they think about the Japanese. And so, therefore, it is something that that it might be beyond a threat. It might be beyond a threat of the war happening, but this is a way of dealing with the racial issue in British Columbia. As you can see, here's a lot of the fishing boats that were compounded. Most of them were sold away, and so the competition between Japanese fishermen and others basically goes away. Because either the boats were sold or they were no longer, after the war, they were no longer seaworthy, needed too much work, and so therefore oftentimes were sold or junked. And so, and we'll also find out that most Japanese were not allowed to come back to British Columbia, and so that's part of it as well. So, Canadian War Measures Act. Enacted in 1914, this allowed the government to assume wide sweeping emergency powers in the event of war, invasion, or insurrection. And this brings up the time-honored question of how much should individual rights be impeded during wartime. How much does the government need to show that there's issues with specific people and they're abusing their rights, or how much is it that people need to show, or that this just happens during wartime and that individual rights are impeded during wartime? Basically, this Canadian War Measures Act was on the books, and so all it took was an order in council on February 1942, used powers under the War Measures Act to create a 100-mile zone around the West Coast, forced the evacuation of Japanese males of military age, and restricted radio usage, and banned Japanese from fishing. Japanese internment in Canada. Notice to all persons, Japanese persons, and persons of Japanese racial origin. Take notice that under orders numbers 21, 22, 23, and 24 of British Columbia Security Commission, the following areas were made prohibited. And so that's just how they went through and said that these are the first people that need to leave their homes. Here's another family. The movement of 23,000 Japanese Canadians during the war was the largest mass exodus in Canadian history. So here's some dates just to take a look at. 1941, 1,200 Canadian fishing boats are impounded. Japanese newspapers and schools close. 1942, removal begins of Japanese immigrant males from coastal areas. 1942, all male Japanese Canadian citizens between the ages of 18 and 45 are ordered to be removed from the 100-mile wide zone along the coast of British Columbia. 1942, February 26, mass evacuation of Japanese Canadians begins, some given only 24 hours notice. Cars, cameras, radios confiscated for protective measures, and curfews were imposed. By March 4th, the Japanese Canadians ordered to turn over their property and belongings to the custodian of enemy alien property. We're going to talk about this, but basically Canada took all the property from the Japanese and then sold it for very little. Eventually these assets were sold and proceeds used to pay for internment, and oftentimes giving whites a good deal on the goods. British Columbia Security Commission initiates a scheme of forcing men to road camps and women and children to ghost town detention centers. It's kind of funny that they said they paid for internment, but most of the men were forced to work on roads in British Columbia to help with the war effort in the and working, and then obviously timber camps, taking down and used as shortages. Other Japanese were then forced to go work on farms. They could also become farm laborers if the men wanted to, and then stay with their women and children. And oftentimes Canada was separating these and using these people to help with the war effort in pretty harsh conditions. Order of Council in 1942, the custodian of alien property. So this was passed by Mackenzie King and his government. Businesses, cars, boats confiscated and sold by the Canadian government before they were forced into labor camps, and then they used that to pay for the labor camps. Did not pay them for their work, did not pay them for any of the things that they were doing, just push forward. There was several Japanese farmers, Japanese Canadians without their property assets or jobs when they were charged inequitably for their internment. Herderos, a veteran of the Second World War, had 5 acres of Surrey farmland, a neighboring area of Vancouver, which was confiscated and sold for $36. He received a check of $15, which included charges for administrative costs and a transaction which he did not approve. He subsequently made several appeals to the government to recover the land, but these failed. And this is Justice Our Time, the Japanese Canadians redress settlement. This is something that they look at later, but obviously this man who had a farm loses his farmland because of the fact that it was sold. He actually winds up volunteering for the Canadian Army and fights in the Army, and yet his land was sold because of the internment. Here's an economic losses survey, Toronto 1946, estimated losses from sold property. Now this isn't the fact that basically the property was sold for a lot less, so that's 787 Canadian dollars, and that's current dollars, so that's almost almost $1 million worth of property losses that people take. You can also see that there's a lot more property lost, stolen, and unaccounted for. 2,594,000 of lost revenue and wages. Other losses, fees retained by the custodian of enemy and evacuee property. They sold the property without the consent of the owners and then took $76,000 worth of fees. Almost $4 million worth of losses for 22,000 people. When we think of, we don't look at this number as being very big, but when you think about it, it was only somewhere between 21 and 23,000, depending on who you look at, Japanese. This is a tremendous amount of loss. Most of them did not have anything except the belongings that they took with them to the camps. Just go over some things here. Men were the first, then the rest came. Worked from 18 to 45 were sent to work. These were the first people that were moved out of the camps. About 945 men worked on road construction camps at Blue River and some other like 4 other camps. Those men who complained about the separation for their families, as well as other dissident men who violated curfew hours, were sent to prisoner of war camps. So there were Japanese that did kind of give some kind of civil disobedience. Japanese workers were seen as a solution to the worker shortage. Men choose to work for beet farmers, to be with their families. Internment camps, 10 camps, 3 road camps, and 7 self-sustaining camps. But most of these camps were like ghost towns that were already built and somewhat refurbished. But in a lot of conditions, the camps were even worse than the ones in the United States. Road camps in Ontario, families sent poorly constructed camps, camps that could not really keep out the Canadian winter. Various camps in the Lilyhood area was a little bit different situation. This is where middle and upper class families could stay together, rent or lease farms in that area, and farm and obviously produce food for the war effort. And so this is one of the only 1,161 of the internees. They basically paid for their relocation with money that they still had in accounts. They leased farms in these desolate areas. And these provided a much less restrictive, punitive environment. And these Canadians were still considered enemy aliens by the government, but obviously, if you had money, you could get a much better situation than if you didn't, and that's just kind of a justice issue here. Prove your loyalty. This was one of the darker, I think, things of Mackenzie King and his government. This whole Prove Your Loyalty campaign came about. They were asked to move west of the Rockies or sign papers to be repatriated. Many moved to the prairies, Ontario, Quebec. Over 4,000 Canadian citizens were deported, and many were tricked and forced to go. The forms that they were signed, they were told that they were signing loyalty papers. They were signing papers so that they could be released from camps, and oftentimes they were signing to be deported. Many of them found themselves being deported without their own consent and didn't realize that that was going to happen. We can see that and this starts in 1944 and continues even to after the war is over, and there's constant sending of people. But basically, you prove your loyalty. You move west of the Rockies. You be repatriated. Many moved to the prairies, Ontario and Quebec, when it was over. So this is the different camps. You can see that they're moved over here. Many of the camps in British Columbia are on the coast here. But the idea with the Rockies right here is that they wanted all Japanese to move east of the Rockies after the war, which obviously then solves the racial issue, but it makes no sense why you wouldn't let people come back and move to British Columbia unless there was another motive after the war was over. Some other conditions in the camps: housed in huts with bedrooms and a kitchen, shared by two families oftentimes, no electricity or running water. You can see just the conditions here. Water until 1943. This is just kind of one of the camps. Another thing that happened at these camps is that British Columbia and other provinces refused to pay for the education of the Japanese Canadians, and they refused to send teachers or allow them to come to the schools of British Columbia. And so eventually the Catholic Church actually and other church organizations came in and provided education. Camp conditions continued. Hundreds of women and children were squeezed into livestock buildings, slept on beds, covered in straw comfort. Conditions were so poor, and this is in Hastings camps, conditions were so poor that the Red Cross dropped packages or brought packages into these camps because the people were at that condition, at that point, similar to prisoners of war that needed these provisions. And so the Red Cross felt like that was so bad that they needed to give them food and other goods. End of the war, 1944, King basically declared that, so in 1944, Mackenzie King states, "It is desirable that the Canadians are spread throughout Canada. Voluntary repatriation, those not repatriated had to move east of the Rockies." So basically he's saying, let's repatriate all the Japanese that want to go, and that became a dark mark on Canada because many were tricked. Over, like we've talked about, 4,000, whereas voluntary repatriation in the United States was 4,000, but the percentages were way lopsided. You also have a situation where they were forced to move of the Rockies, and we're going to look at some charts when we come to class and look at the population and how many people were forced to move, and this really just shows a complete disengagement from wartime now. We're talking about the fact that they want to move Japanese throughout and not have them concentrate in one area. And that just seems like the motives there are not legit. Order in Council the Order in Council creates the National Emergency Transition Powers Act, which was passed in 1945 that kept internment in place until 1947. Why? Why would you keep internment 2 years after the war was over? In 1945, the government extended the Order in Council to force the Japanese Canadians to move to Japan and lose their Canadian citizenship or move to Eastern Canada. Even though the war was over, it was illegal for Japanese Canadians to return to Vancouver until 1949. There doesn't seem to be any reason for that. Public protest, basically, by other Canadians would eventually stop the deportations, but not before 4,000 Japanese left the country. And so this seemed to be Mackenzie King trying to solve a race problem rather than protecting Canada from the war. And you can see that as all of these things went, that seemed to be the case. Now, after the war in 1949, the April Citizenship Act was passed, which extends franchise to all Asians except the Japanese. Again, another show of what was going on. For the Japanese Canadians, there were no homes, farms, or other property left behind before internment. They were forced to start their lives over with no economic resources in an estranged, racially repressive environment of the Midwest and Eastern Canada. And given no apology, no money to start over, but basically had to start over and had to move in a country that they considered home.